Lieutenant Commander Sarah Hawk Mitchell had spent 12 years proving herself in a world where women weren't supposed to belong. The Naval Air Station buzzed with morning activity as she walked across the tarmac, her flight suit crisp despite the early hour. At 34, she commanded respect not because of her gender, but because she was simply one of the best pilots the Navy had ever produced. Her record spoke volumes. Sarah had completed over 200 combat missions across 3 deployments, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross twice, and saved countless lives during rescue operations in hostile territory. She flew F-18 Super Hornets with a precision that made seasoned pilots shake their heads in admiration. Her call sign, Hawk, came naturally. She had eyes that could spot enemy movement from miles away and reflexes that could thread a needle in a hurricane. The trouble started 3 months ago during a joint training exercise with SEAL Team 7. The mission was supposed to be routine, provide close air support for a mock rescue operation in the Nevada desert. Sarah had done hundreds of similar missions, but this one would change everything. The SEALs were pinned down by simulated enemy fire in a canyon when Sarah received their distress call. Standard protocol required waiting for ground control clearance before engaging, but the team leader's voice crackled through her headset with genuine panic. Real equipment had malfunctioned, and what started as training had become a life-or-death situation. "Hawk, we've got men trapped under actual falling rocks. The explosion triggered a landslide." Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez's voice cut through the static. "We need immediate extraction, not simulation." Sarah made a split-second decision that would haunt her career. Without waiting for official clearance, she dove her Super Hornet into the canyon, using the aircraft's downwash to clear debris and create a safe zone for helicopter evacuation. The maneuver was dangerous, unauthorized, and completely against protocol. It also saved 6 lives. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Admiral Harrison, a by-the-book officer who had earned his stars through strict adherence to military regulation, led the inquiry personally. He was a man who believed that rules existed for good reasons and that exceptions, no matter how well-intentioned, set dangerous precedents. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," the Admiral had said during her hearing, his steel-gray eyes fixed on her personnel file. "Your actions, while heroic in intent, violated direct orders and endangered both yourself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft. The Navy cannot function if officers decide when to follow orders based on their personal judgment." Sarah stood at attention, knowing her career was hanging by a thread. "Sir, with respect, those men would have died if I had waited for clearance. Sometimes saving lives has to come before following procedure." The Admiral's expression hardened. "The Navy has procedures specifically to prevent the kind of cowboy behavior you displayed. What if your aircraft had crashed? What if the downwash had caused more injuries? You took it upon yourself to make command decisions that weren't yours to make." The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, testimonies, and sleepless nights. The 6 SEALs whose lives Sarah had saved tried to testify on her behalf, but military justice moved according to its own logic. Chief Rodriguez had written a letter stating that without Sarah's intervention, his team would have suffered casualties, possibly fatalities. But Admiral Harrison remained unmoved. Sarah's squadron mates watched the proceedings with a mixture of admiration and concern. They knew she had done the right thing, but they also understood the military's need for order and discipline. Captain Williams, her commanding officer, had tried to intervene behind the scenes, arguing that Sarah's exemplary record should count for something. "She's the best pilot I've ever commanded," Captain Williams had told the Admiral privately. 12 years of perfect service, multiple commendations, 0 incidents. This was a judgment call made under extreme circumstances. But Admiral Harrison had made up his mind. "Captain, I respect your opinion of Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's abilities. However, The military cannot function if we allow exceptions based on individual merit. If we excuse her actions today, where does it end? Every pilot will think they can ignore orders if they believe their judgment is superior. The final blow came when Sarah learned that the Admiral had recommended not just disciplinary action, but discharge from service. After 12 years of dedicated service, her career was being ended not for cowardice or incompetence, but for caring too much about the lives of her fellow service members. The night before her dismissal ceremony, Sarah sat in her quarters, staring at her medals and commendations. The Distinguished Flying Cross seemed to mock her now, a reminder of a career that was about to end in disgrace. She thought about all the missions she had flown, all the lives she had helped save, and wondered if any of it had mattered. Her phone buzzed with messages from fellow pilots expressing their support, but Sarah felt more alone than she ever had. Tomorrow, she would hand in her wings and walk away from the only life she had ever known. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to save lives, she had destroyed her own career. As she packed her personal belongings, Sarah couldn't help but feel that the military was losing something important. Not just her skills as a pilot, but the willingness to put human lives above rigid adherence to rules. She had always believed that the military's primary purpose was to protect people, but now it seemed that protecting procedure was more important than protecting people. The morning of Sarah's dismissal ceremony arrived with an unseasonably clear sky, as if nature itself wanted to provide the perfect backdrop for what many considered a travesty of military justice. The ceremony was scheduled for 0900 hours at the main parade ground of Naval Air Station Oceana, and despite the early hour, word had spread throughout the base. Admiral Harrison had insisted on a formal ceremony, believing it would serve as an example to other officers about the consequences of insubordination. He stood on the reviewing platform in his dress whites, his chest decorated with ribbons earned over 30 years of service. To his left stood Captain Williams and other senior officers, their faces carefully neutral, despite their personal feelings about the proceedings. Sarah walked onto the parade ground with her head held high, flanked by 2 junior officers who served as ceremonial escorts. She wore her dress blues for the last time, each ribbon and medal on her chest representing years of dedication and sacrifice. The Distinguished Flying Cross caught the morning sunlight, and for a moment she remembered the day she had earned it during a particularly dangerous rescue mission over Afghanistan. In the assembled crowd, Sarah noticed faces she recognized from years of service: maintenance crews who had worked on her aircraft, fellow pilots who had flown alongside her, and administrative staff who had processed her mission reports. Their presence meant more to her than they could know. In a military culture that often discouraged public displays of emotion, their attendance was a quiet form of protest. Near the back of the formation stood 12 members of SEAL Team 7, including Chief Rodriguez and the 5 other men whose lives Sarah had saved. They hadn't been invited to the ceremony, but military protocol couldn't prevent them from being present on the base during a public ceremony. Their dress uniforms were immaculate, their bearing proud, and their eyes fixed firmly on Sarah rather than the Admiral who was about to end her career. Admiral Harrison approached the podium with measured steps, his speech prepared and his resolve firm. He had faced criticism for his decision from various quarters, including some very senior officers who questioned the wisdom of dismissing one of the Navy's most capable pilots. But he believed firmly that military discipline required consistency, regardless of the personal cost. "We are gathered here today," the Admiral began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent parade ground, "to witness the conclusion of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell's naval career. While her service record contains many commendable achievements, her recent actions demonstrated a fundamental disregard for military authority and protocol." Sarah stood at attention as the Admiral continued his prepared remarks, but her mind wandered to all the flights she had taken, all the missions she had completed successfully. She thought about the young pilots she had mentored, the lives she had helped save, and the pride she had felt wearing the Navy uniform. In a few minutes, all of that would be officially over. Military discipline is not negotiable, Admiral Harrison continued. When officers decide to substitute their judgment for properly constituted authority, they undermine the very foundations upon which our military effectiveness depends. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's actions, regardless of their intentions, cannot be excused or overlooked. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical precision. Sarah was called forward to surrender her wings, the gold symbol that represented not just her qualification as a naval aviator, but her identity for the past 12 years. As she unpinned them from her uniform, she felt a part of herself being torn away. It was at that exact moment, as Sarah held her wings in her hand and prepared to place them on the ceremonial table, that the sound began. At first, it was just a distant rumble, the kind of noise that military personnel instinctively recognize as aircraft engines. But this sound was different, deeper, more powerful, and growing steadily louder. Admiral Harrison paused in his reading of the dismissal order, a slight frown crossing his face as he looked toward the sky. The assembled crowd began to murmur and shift, their attention diverted from the ceremony to the approaching aircraft. Even the SEALs, trained to maintain perfect military bearing in all circumstances, found their eyes drawn upward. The sound grew to a thunderous roar, and then, appearing from the east like a vision from another world, an F-22 Raptor streaked across the parade ground at precisely 500 feet. The aircraft was flying slow and low, its massive engines creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. But this wasn't just any flyby. The F-22 was flying in the missing man formation, a tribute traditionally reserved for fallen pilots. Every person on the parade ground understood the significance immediately. The missing man formation was sacred in military aviation, a final salute to pilots who had made the ultimate sacrifice. To use it for Sarah's dismissal ceremony was an unprecedented gesture, a statement that transcended words and protocol. The F-22 pilot executed a perfect barrel roll directly over the ceremony, a maneuver that required extraordinary skill and was definitely not part of any authorized flight plan. As the aircraft roared past, Sarah could see the pilot's helmet clearly, and she could swear she saw a brief salute from the cockpit. Admiral Harrison stood frozen at the podium, his prepared speech forgotten as the implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. This wasn't just an aircraft passing overhead. This was a deliberate and very public show of support for the woman he was dismissing. Someone with access to one of the military's most advanced fighters had decided to make a statement that the entire base would remember. The 12 SEALs had moved to attention the moment the F-22 appeared, their hands snapping to their foreheads in perfect synchronization. They held their salutes throughout the entire flyby, their eyes tracking the aircraft as it disappeared toward the horizon. Other service members in the crowd began to follow their example until nearly everyone present was saluting either the aircraft or Sarah herself. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward from the SEAL formation, his voice cutting through the diminishing engine noise. "Lieutenant Commander Mitchell," he called out, his words formal but his tone filled with emotion. "SEAL Team 7 requests permission to render honors." Without waiting for official permission that would never come, the 12 SEALs executed a crisp about-face and marched to positions directly in front of Sarah. In perfect unison, they came to attention and rendered the slow, ceremonial salute reserved for the highest honors. They held their salutes for a full 30 seconds while the crowd watched in absolute silence. The silence that followed the SEAL's salute seemed to stretch for an eternity. Admiral Harrison stood at the podium, his carefully planned ceremony completely derailed by events that no protocol manual had ever anticipated. The F-22's engines had faded to a distant whisper, but the impact of its passage would resonate far beyond Naval Air Station Oceana. Sarah remained at attention, her wings still clutched in her hand, but something fundamental had changed. The dismissal ceremony was supposed to mark her disgrace and serve as a warning to other officers. Instead, it had become a powerful demonstration of the respect and admiration she commanded among her fellow service members. Admiral Harrison attempted to regain control of the situation, clearing his throat and returning to his prepared remarks. As I was saying, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's dismissal from service is effective immediately. She is hereby stripped of her commission and ordered to surrender all military property and privileges. But his words seemed hollow now, overwhelmed by the symbolic power of what had just occurred. The crowd remained at attention, many still saluting, and the Admiral realized that his authority had been publicly challenged in a way that no amount of military discipline could easily repair. As the ceremony concluded with mechanical efficiency, Sarah wondered who had arranged the flyby. F-22 Raptors were among the most restricted aircraft in the military arsenal, and their flight schedules were planned weeks in advance. Someone with significant influence had risked their own career to honor hers. The answer came 3 days later, delivered through an encrypted message that appeared in Sarah's personal email. The sender was Colonel James "Thunder" Thompson, one of the Air Force's most decorated F-22 pilots, and, unbeknownst to most people, Sarah's younger brother. "Sis," the message began, "I couldn't let them dismiss you without a proper send-off. The F-22 community has been following your case, and we all agree that you got a raw deal. What you did took courage, and courage should be rewarded, not punished. I may face disciplinary action for the unauthorized flyby, but some things are more important than career advancement. The missing man formation wasn't just for show. It was recognition that the military is losing someone who truly understands what service means." Sarah stared at the message for a long time, tears blurring her vision. James had always been the rebellious one in their family, but she never imagined he would risk his own stellar career for a gesture of support. She thought about their childhood, growing up in a military family where service and duty were core values, and how both of them had chosen to follow their father's path into aviation. The fallout from the ceremony extended far beyond what anyone had anticipated. Within 24 hours, video footage of the F-22 flyby had appeared on social media platforms, shared by service members who had witnessed the event. The story of Sarah's dismissal and the dramatic tribute spread rapidly through military networks and eventually reached mainstream news outlets. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Sarah's actions and critical of Admiral Harrison's decision. Veterans organizations issued statements defending her, and several retired generals publicly questioned the wisdom of dismissing officers for making difficult decisions under extreme circumstances. The hashtag #FlyForSarah began trending on social media, accompanied by thousands of messages from current and former service members sharing their own stories of times when following orders blindly would have cost lives. Admiral Harrison found himself under intense scrutiny from the Pentagon, forced to defend his decision to increasingly skeptical senior officers. The Secretary of the Navy requested a full review of the case, and rumors began circulating that the Admiral's own career might be in jeopardy. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her small apartment near the base. Captain Williams stood at her door in civilian clothes, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I have something you need to see." The envelope contained a letter from the Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the Navy. The letter informed her that her case was being reviewed at the highest levels, and that serious consideration was being given to reversing Admiral Harrison's decision. More importantly, it included an offer. If she chose to return to service, she would be assigned to a special position developing new protocols for close air support operations. The Pentagon has realized something important, Captain Williams explained as Sarah read the letter. You didn't break the rules out of arrogance or insubordination. You broke them because sometimes the rules don't account for real-world situations where lives hang in the balance. They want you to help write better rules. Sarah looked up from the letter, her mind racing. What about Admiral Harrison? Captain Williams' expression grew serious. The Admiral has been reassigned to a Pentagon desk job. The official word is that it's a promotion, but everyone knows it's actually a sideways move to get him out of operational command. The Navy brass realized that his rigid interpretation of regulations was doing more harm than good to military readiness. The offer to return to service came with conditions. Sarah would have to complete additional training on protocol and military law, and her new position would involve significant oversight and review of her decisions. But it also came with an unprecedented opportunity to influence how the military balanced adherence to procedure with the need for flexible decision-making in crisis situations. 6 months later, Sarah found herself back in a flight suit, but this time her mission was different. She was leading a team of experienced pilots and legal experts in developing new training protocols that taught officers when and how to make critical decisions that might fall outside normal procedures. The program was called the Emergency Decision-Making Initiative, and it was being watched carefully by military leaders around the world. The first graduates of her program included several pilots who had found themselves in similar situations to the one Sarah had faced, torn between following orders and saving lives. They learned not just the importance of military discipline, but also the equally important skill of making sound judgments under extreme pressure. Chief Rodriguez and his SEAL team became frequent participants in the training exercises Sarah designed. Their perspective on ground operations helped pilots understand the real-world consequences of their decisions. The mutual respect between the SEALs and Sarah had only grown stronger since the dismissal ceremony, and their partnership became a model for inter-service cooperation. Colonel Thompson eventually faced a formal reprimand for his unauthorized flyby, but the punishment was largely symbolic. The Air Force leadership quietly acknowledged that his actions had helped bring attention to important issues of military justice and decision-making. He continued flying F-22s and was eventually promoted to full colonel. Admiral Harrison served out his remaining years until retirement at his Pentagon desk, writing reports that few people read and attending meetings that accomplished little. He never publicly acknowledged that his handling of Sarah's case had been misguided, but those close to him noticed that his rigid adherence to procedure seemed to soften somewhat in his final years of service. 2 years after the dismissal ceremony that never quite accomplished its intended purpose, Sarah stood on the same parade ground at Naval Air Station Oceana. This time, she was there to address a graduating class of naval aviators about the importance of moral courage in military service. As she looked out at the young faces in the audience, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. Her career had been derailed and then restored, her reputation tarnished and then burnished, and her understanding of military service fundamentally changed. She had learned that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty to the military was to challenge it when it lost sight of its core mission. The F-22 flyby had lasted only minutes, but its impact continued to ripple through the military years later. It had become a symbol of the tension between rigid adherence to rules and the moral courage to do what was right when lives were at stake. For Sarah, it represented something even more important, the knowledge that when you stand up for what you believe in, you rarely stand alone.